Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and today we're going to be talking about these. These are a couple of controllers originally designed by Hori and ultimately reproduced by Retrobit for the Nintendo 64. Before we go into that though, I do want to thank Castlemania Games for providing these. They were donated to me absolutely for free for the purpose of review, so I just want to give you guys full disclosure on that. So thank you again to them. If you're interested in anything they have, these or any other products, in the description there will be a link. You can feel free to go ahead and check it out. So thank you very much to Castlemania Games. Now, purpose of this video. What we're going to be doing here is talking about these controllers, specifically reviewing them, but also giving them a little bit of history. In general, when I talk about these type of controllers or any sort of things like that, like here I did one on the Retro Fighters Nintendo 64 controller, which we'll get back to in a little bit, I like to give some sort of history about how it came into creation. And I'll do that here. The problem with this one is that there's bits and pieces of information I simply do not have access to that would kind of really help, and you'll see what I mean. So basically, when the Nintendo 64 came out, this was the controller we got. Here's the original design that I'm sure a lot of us are very infamously aware of. Now, to be honest with you, I never had a problem with this controller. I grew up with it, so to me it's instantly familiar. But that's muscle memory, and that's also the power of nostalgia, and frankly just kind of, you know, really growing up on it. You know, your muscle memory is forming at your most formative, influential years, so to me, holding the N64 controller is no big deal. But I don't represent everybody. In fact, I just represent myself. So, what that means is a lot of people ultimately did not really like the Nintendo 64 controller. They kind of aged out of it. Or when you try to introduce a new generation of gamers to it, whether they are simply younger people or if they just didn't play it when it was relevant, the N64 controller is not the most inviting controller considering what we've become used to. So this was a problem that is not new. They've been aware of this really since the relevancy of the N64. And along came a company called Hori. Now, Hori is a Japanese third-party controller and accessory peripherals company. I've been to Japan multiple times, and they're very respected there. Like, they have a lot of stuff. This isn't some Mad Cats like garbage. These guys actually make good things. Their name is associated with quality, which is a good thing to have. So to this day, they still make products for Switch and PS4 and so on. But that they did do this back in the day. They made different types of controllers and accessories. Now, with the Nintendo 64, they looked at the controller and said, we can do better than that. And with Nintendo's consent, they went ahead and designed what is basically the controller you see in front of you. Here's where it gets a little mucky. I can't figure out exactly when the Hori controller actually came out. I've tried looking into this, and I've yet to come up with a clear answer. I can't find any information on it prior to like 2011, but it must have come out in the late 90s, if not the early aughts. And the reason I think that is, well, first of all, why would Hori make a controller when they're supposed to be a dedicated, like, relevant third-party controller company? I don't see why they would make one, like, well after the Nintendo 64 was no longer relevant. And secondly, the other thing that's kind of just throwing a monkey wrench in there is that when you look at it, the thumbstick on this thing is hauntingly similar to that of a Nintendo GameCube controller. So part of me is thinking one of two scenarios, and if anybody knows, I invite this information to be presented in the comments. I would really like to know this. I'm genuinely asking, when did this controller originally come out? Because it looks like what might have happened is either A, Hori came up with that design and Nintendo said, oh, that's a cool like thumb pad, we're going to put that on the GameCube. Since they were working together, there was probably no issue with that. Or there's a possibility that around the time of the GameCube, Hori went, hey, can we make an N64 controller? I mean, the console's still kind of relevant, it's still got a little life in it, we could probably do it better, you're moving on to the GameCube, is that cool? And then that's how it came out. Either way, I'm kind of stating that I believe this controller probably came out in the late 90s, early aughts. You know, somewhere between like 99 and 2001, 2002-ish. That's kind of what I'm guessing, but I don't actually know. What I do know is the controller only came out in Japan and for the long time was sought after. So at some point around 2011 and really kind of on steroids from like 2015 to like now, the Hori controller suddenly had a lot of demand in the West. Like there was a lot of people being like, I want access to that controller. That's like the best N64 controller ever. How do I get it? So a ton of people started importing them, and prices on these things were going for like $100 to $150 per controller. I don't know exactly what set that off. I do remember Pete Dorr making a video about them a long time ago, and then that kind of opened the door, I think. If I had to say, and I could definitely be wrong about this, I kind of feel like Pete Dorr opened that door, no pun intended. But yeah, I think that's a possibility. Either way, you know, good for him. But suddenly there was a lot of demand on these controllers. Now, it's kind of funny. I mean, like I said, I've been to Japan multiple times, and I've seen them over there, the actual Hori ones. And over there, they're like $80 in like perfect condition. I've seen them cheaper than that as well, which just tells me, because like, I can't imagine how cheap these things probably were just a few years ago over there, before they realized there was demand on them. You probably, I'm just guessing, considering what I know about Japanese, like, you know, third-party electronics and video game stores, those controllers were probably like $5 all day for like years, I'm guessing. But either way, that still presented a problem. It created a lot of demand for new Nintendo 64 controllers, but not enough products. So there were different alternatives. One of them was the Retro Fighters controller, which I've already done a video on. You can check it out. This is the Brawler 64. This controller I ended up liking so much, it replaced the Nintendo 64 controller for me. But to be fair, this is supposedly the king. This is the original Hori controller, sort of. And that supposedly was the best one ever. So with all this demand, Retrobit, which is a company that goes about reproducing new controllers for the Western market for retro consoles, got their hands on the molds by Hori. I can only assume through some sort of deal they must have struck with them. So these are essentially reproductions of the Hori controllers, which you probably concluded on your own already. You're smart. But yeah, obviously they've had, without even opening it, I can tell you they've made a few changes. On the back, all the molding must be different. They don't say Nintendo on them anymore. They don't say Hori on them. They changed all that type of stuff, which is to be expected, much like they did with the Sega Genesis ones and Sega Saturn ones. Although they did allow it to still say Sega, because Sega authorized that. Nintendo I'm sure did not authorize this, but I'm sure Nintendo doesn't really care either. But either way, Retrobit went ahead and made these things. Now, I'm going to open it up, but I also want to give the disclaimer that I do not actually, unfortunately, own the original Hori controller, so I can't really give a comparison of that specifically, which kind of sucks, but it is what it is. And I will say, you're probably wondering why I have two of these things. I thought the same thing as well when Castlemania first sent them to me, but it turns out there is a reason for this. The green one, which you see over here, is the one we'll primarily be focusing on. That one is actually specifically for the Nintendo 64. This one over here, the red one, is not. This is actually the same mold, obviously, but this one is designed specifically for PC, Mac, and Switch, at least according to the box. So I'll probably use it on the Nintendo Switch. I'm also going to plug it into a couple of other USB-based consoles and see if it works with anything. But yeah, for now, you can just kind of look at it. But yeah, let's focus on this one. So it's cool. There is a USB-based version of this if you're curious. I did hold the original Hori controller once, and I remember being kind of like, oh, cool. But without actually playing it, you know, you don't really get the greatest sense of it. But despite that, we're about to just hold it and judge it. So taking it out of the packaging here, nice design. It's nice transparent green. I know already that they obviously changed that to say Retrobit, as I mentioned before. And the back, like I said, yeah, the molding is very different. It's called the Tribute 64 now. So holding it, you know, again, I'm not playing a game, but it does feel, ooh, what I really like here is where the grips on the back, there's this kind of gap for your fingers. That feels really nice. Some people point out that they don't really like the placement of the D-pad, finding it odd that it would be in the center. To be honest with you, I thought the same thing at first, but now it kind of makes sense once you kind of hold it. The buttons feel really good, actually. And again, I say this without being able to compare it to the original. I mean, I compare this original, but the Hori original. So the original Nintendo 64 controller had basically two ways you could hold it. You either had to hold it this way and cut off access to the D-pad, or you had to take it this way and you couldn't have access to the thumbstick, or you could hold it this way and you wouldn't have access to the buttons. With this, you only have one way to hold it. Which means, if I had to guess, I'd say they basically kind of concluded, like, look, the majority of Nintendo 64 games either do not require the D-pad or have limited access to it. So what we'll do is we'll put it in the middle, we'll basically swap the positions, compress the size. Most people prefer to use the thumbstick anyway, and if they want access to the D-pad, they'll still have it. And you can still play pretty comfortably with that. They also obviously moved the Z button in the back from being a trigger to having it be the more modern sense of a trigger, which is funny because obviously, well, we're assuming that this controller came out in the late 90s, so they kind of, I'm not going to say they were ahead of it, because obviously by that point the PS1 controller was out, but still, that's cool. They had that. Yeah, I really like the feel of the C buttons. This is pretty solid. Start button's a little high, but that's, you know, not that big of a deal considering it's the least used button, I would assume, since you only use it to pause generally. So that's cool. But yeah, no, I like the design of this just based on the initial feel. Compared to the Retro Fighters, I definitely like the thumbstick better on the Retro bit. Like, it's immediately apparent. Like, the grips on it are really nice. Yeah, I definitely like that better. But, you know, aside from that, hard to say. This might do it, but I have to actually play with it for a while. So I've been using this thing for a while now, and it's time for final thoughts. I don't know if I can go so far as to say this is like the definitive, iconic, best controller ever. It's really good. It is better than the standard Nintendo 64 controller. And of course, when I say best controller ever, I'm talking about within the context of the Nintendo 64. I think this was definitely the best controller at one point. When I compare it to the Retro Fighters, I'm still, you know, to be honest with you, I'm still not really sure which one is better. I will say, without a doubt, the thumbstick on this controller, infinitely better than the one on the Retro Fighters. But I kind of feel like if you had this thumbstick on the Retro Fighters, this would be the best controller. That's just kind of my initial instinct. When I played with this thing, much like with the Retro Fighters, there was that initial, like, my hands aren't quite there. They're not used to playing GoldenEye that way. You know what I mean? With the Retro Fighters, I felt like I got over that faster than I did with the Hori controller, or Retro Bit controller. The only mistake I really made as I was playing the game routinely is whenever I would want to pause to, like, change my weapon or whatever, I realized you can just press A a bunch of times, I'm aware. But when I would do that, on the N64 standard controller, never had a problem. On the Retro Fighters, never had a problem. And this one, I would just, without looking, I would often just hit the B button, which is more on me, but it had something to do with muscle memory and where my hands were at. But is that a big complaint? Hell no. This is a really good controller. Do not get it tangled. This is a solid controller. I really quite enjoyed it. It worked great with everything I played it with. Response time was totally perfect. It was quite good. I just don't know yet. I haven't played with these both enough to be able to say which one is better. I will say I think I like the physical shape of the Retro Fighters controller better, but without dispute, the thumbstick on the Retro Bit Hori controller, different level. I will say though, for sure, they're both better than the original controller. I have no qualms about that. Also, one thing I should have pointed out is that this cable length is 10 feet. I have no idea what the original cable length was, but hopefully it's an improvement. A lot of people made fun of me on the last one because I don't know why I got it into my head that this, like, I went like this, and I was like, oh yeah, so that's a meter, which would be about 3 feet. And I thought later, obviously, I was like, that's not 3 feet. That was 3 feet when you were a little kid. I don't know, like this, like little, your teacher ever teach you something when you were a little kid and you just kind of like kept it, and then like for some reason that just popped back into my brain as if that would still be true. I don't know. So I apologize to everybody who watched that one. Yes, I'm aware that this is not 3 feet in length / 1 meter. But anyway, so there was one of those, wow, I can't believe I screwed up that badly type of moments. But yeah, so that's about it. That's about my thoughts on this controller. It's solid, and it, you know, depending on the size of your hands and all that stuff, it might be the best controller. It definitely beats the original, and with the Retro Fighters being its only real competition, it's just like, you know, honestly, I could kind of go either way. This one definitely has the better thumbstick, but like I said, I still feel like the physical shape of this is probably better considering what we're all used to now. I did a video on this as well if you want to check it out, but I almost feel like if you could put this thumbstick just on this controller, done. That's what I think. But, you know, not 100%, because maybe the buttons, I gotta admit, are probably a little better on the Retro Pit. It's like they both have almost all of everything you need, but neither one is quite totally 100% there. Oh, and I used it on the Switch and stuff like that, and it was the same basic experience. It would not be my go-to way to play the Switch, I've got to be honest with you, just because it's not really designed for the Switch. It's just like, oh, cool, it works. Plus, I don't have like a whole N64 emulator catalog or anything like that. I don't do any of the download stuff for the Switch, so it's not really there for me. So, like I said, I'm mostly using this for N64. But yeah, that's it. Thank you again to Castlemania Games for providing this for me. Thank you guys very much for watching. If you could, please like, comment, subscribe, and all that great stuff. I really appreciate it. All the social media links, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Patreon, all that great stuff in the description. Really appreciate that as well. Thank you very much. I'll see you all later.